The status of the author has changed. French philosopher Roland Barthes argues in his seminal work Image, Music, Text that the idea of authorship is relatively recent, with previous cultures not attributing works to singular figures, yet in recent centuries there has been a capitalistic drive to monopolize on individuals who are enshrined as the source of a text's meaning. For Barthes, this has led to a restrictive tradition where authors are worshipped, driving people to believe that meaning has resided only in them. In contrast, the philosopher believes that the author can never create anything original, and that all their works are borrowed from a multitude of resources in the culture. Therefore, true meaning is found in the removal of the author and the exposure of these intertextual maps, which the reader can then untangle. This concept of intertextuality is defined by Allen as a new vision of meaning, and thus of authorship and reading, a vision resistant to ingrained notions of originality, uniqueness, singularity, and autonomy, which liberates the reader away from traditional ideas of the author having complete textual authority. J.R.R. Tolkien's prominence throughout the 20th century is a suitable case study for the area of intertextuality, particularly his work, The Lord of the Rings, with the linguist's fantasy world being rooted in ancient mythology and therefore relying heavily on other source texts. His love for philology demonstrates Tolkien's fascination with language, revealing a significantly intellectual inspiration behind the work. His novels could arguably be called palimpsests, non-original rewriting of what has already been written. Yet this definition insinuates that none of what Tolkien wrote was original. His novels sold approximately 100 million copies, and with the adaptations grossing almost $3 billion, with Peter Jackson's film significantly broadening the demographic of the audience, the subsequent adaptations and fandom have been fueled by a fidelity to Tolkien as an author, with textual accuracy in both cases seen as paramount in comparison to individual meaning. This essay will therefore use the work of The Lord of the Rings to assess the validity of Barthes' claim through analysis of Tolkien's original novels and the inspirations behind them, the blockbuster film adaptations by Peter Jackson and how they add to the franchise, as well as the world of fandom, will be explored in how it ultimately relates back to the work of the author. J.R.R. Tolkien's embrace of medieval literature and culture for The Lord of the Rings suggests that Barthes' theory is partly true, as the philologist relies significantly on works from previous cultures. Yet it is also evident that the writer produced a work that simply had not existed before in England's history. Furthermore, his modernization of ancient mythological tropes reflects how Tolkien did not merely translate his source material to the times, but transformed it for his narrative. An example of this is the adaptation on the medieval trope of the wild man, which Flieger defines as an archetypal outsider, the prowler on the borderlands between the wild and tame, and is revolutionized by Tolkien in his character of Gollum. The creature is described in The Lord of the Rings: The Two Towers as no more than a squirrel, yet Tolkien adds a psychological dimension which subverts the ancient trend, as modern audiences can identify as schizophrenic, with the character repeatedly talking to himself. Hobbits won't kill us, nice hobbits, which transforms this archaic concept from merely a figure that transgresses society's boundaries physically to one who breaches them mentally. Tolkien's modernity takes over, for Gollum's madness is distinctly of the 20th century rather than of the Middle Ages. Yet he uses it in such a way that transforms it into something new. Tolkien furthermore can be seen as being more of a DJ than an oracle, who uses past material in a fresh way.
Made by a creator, one of our natural faculties is wishing to create, but since we aren't creators, we have to sub-create. Let's say we have to rearrange the primary material in some particular form.
Which reflects how the author himself did not see his work as completely his own, but a rearrangement of material in front of him, with the character of King Theoden having deep connections with the ancient Gothic king Theodorid in both name and fate. Shippey's study on this reveals that the charge of the Rohirrim is based off of the account in Jordaen Gothic history of the Battle of the Catalonian Plains, demonstrating how Tolkien's study of philology greatly enriched his narrative. Allen continues, the meaning of the author's words, Barthes suggests, does not originate from the author's own unique consciousness, but from their place within linguistic, cultural systems. With these sites of inspiration reducing Tolkien's agency, he arguably fails to propose anything new. However, Shippey argues that these medieval texts act as a palimpsest for the development of his own ideas, rather than the complete idea. For Shippey, these linguistic inspirations inspire Tolkien to create something new. Roland Barthes' statement, however, that it is language which speaks, not the author, does seem to apply to Tolkien's philological roots, as his fascination with linguistics shaped his fervour for the novels, with the examples of Gothic history particularly applying here. For Tolkien, a word was not like a brick, a single, delimitable unit, but like the top of a stalactite, interesting in itself, but more so as part of something growing. This study of philology, not ignoring its linguistic roots, but embracing them, and how to partake in the world of writing was to undertake a magnitude of loose threads that span back generations. Tolkien uses these intertexts to create a mythology that had not existed in England before, with The Lord of the Rings not just being an update on a previous tradition, but a new installment in a nation's mythological canon. Tolkien's authorship of The Lord of the Rings is thrown under further investigation in light of the Peter Jackson film adaptations, as new audiences associate this world not primarily with the writer of the novels, but with the images of the films, especially upon rereading. Thompson labelled the film trilogy an object of devotion, with the sense of excitement that the filmmakers felt in making it, the love of the material that Tolkien fans share, reflecting how the author was not seen as a starting line, but an anchor point. Barthes, however, would argue that this sense of fidelity is flawed, since the text's unity lies not in its origin, but in its destination, where a text's value should not reside in how closely it matches another text, but what the reader chooses to do with it. Despite this, it could be argued that Jackson's adaptation is almost a fan-made entity, as the director's work has the feel of a film that people who love fantasy, horror, sci-fi, thriller films might make if given $300 million. Reading is not about encountering a fixed thing and unlocking it once and for all, but about an approach to the text that keeps the dynamism of language open and apparent, which could be seen as undermining Tolkien's text as not being some perfect artifact that needs to be carefully approached to receive true meaning, but a mixture of text imparted into the space of the reader who untangles and deciphers it for themselves. Using Thompson's analysis of Genet's process of amplification, where hypotext can go through processes of extension, contamination, and expansion, it can be seen that Jackson is not focused on being completely faithful to the novels, as he borrows and mixes various aspects of filmic language into his work. Films of classic cinema in particular inspire him. As Jackson admits, "I've always thought it would be great to do, a fantasy film in that Harryhausen style, but with computer-generated creatures, with this aspect of horror evident in the scene outside the Mines of Moria, where we see a direct adaptation of Durin's Door from the book. The Watcher-in-the-Dark creature is given significantly more focus as Jackson amplifies Tolkien's descriptions of the beast to increase the level of horror and threat. In the book, the attack is fleeting and somewhat uncertain as to the antagonist's identity, yet Jackson makes the Watcher emerge out of the water, revealing a beastly creature with teeth, evidently trying to eat Frodo, as the Hobbit is thrust into the air. Additionally, the camera moves uncertainly, flying upwards with Frodo at the whim of the Watcher staring down. The music too heightens the tension as violins play harsh notes resembling a horror film, as sounds of piercing flesh and animalistic growls add another dimension to Tolkien's words. This simplification of the films in comparison to the convoluted and intermittently difficult to follow novels reveals an altering to Tolkien's work which ultimately leaves audiences with a slightly different narrative. Hutchins' theory of adaptation further unveils a complicated relationship between page and screen, as cinema's ability to supply sound and visual representations to literature has given classic stories new life, but also new meanings. She argues that the novels then effectively become the derivative and belated works, the ones we then experience second and secondarily, revealing that Tolkien's text is ultimately changed as soon as audiences watch the film adaptations, with any sense of originality being lost. This links to Barthes' point that the text is eternally written here and now, Jackson's adaptations of Moria not being optional additions but imperative rewritings. Subsequently, The Lord of the Rings becomes something continually happening, with Jackson's film significantly altering how audiences read Tolkien's text, with the images and sounds of the adaptation becoming intertwined with the words on the page. Therefore, Tolkien's authorship of The Lord of the Rings is further cast into doubt by Jackson's films, as the process of adaptation alters how the text is read or reread. Yet, the faithfulness of the filmmakers to the novels suggests a necessity for initial text, a hypotext that ultimately acts as a marker of success for any text that grows out from it. This idea of a continual writing of The Lord of the Rings supposes that Tolkien cannot be ascribed as the sole author of the text, with Jackson's films not simply adding to the world of Middle-earth, but becoming part of its fabric. This constant addition to the author's world can be seen most progressively in the climate of fandom, as Barthes' emphasis on reader subjectivity seemingly applies here. Yet, as Gray discovers, fans of the franchise ultimately want to see Tolkien honoured, not dismissed. Through video games, merchandising, films, and television shows, the franchise has surely exceeded Tolkien's wildest expectations, as fan popularity is ultimately out of the author's hands, not being an intended product, but one the reader has produced out of necessity. Whilst Christopher Tolkien objected to this commercialization reducing the aesthetic and philosophical impact of the creation to nothing, there is certainly a thriving world of fandom that has given the reader an opportunity to contribute, as Fisk terms it, in a writerly way, meaning that audiences can contribute to the text rather than just receiving it. The audience can now immerse themselves into this narrative space, namely through fan fiction. Thompson writes how the explosion of fan sites created an unofficial wing of a franchise, as their works are seen as contributing to the space of Middle-earth, not merely being shunned in preference to a superior hypotext, with fans having the freedom to not be faithful to an author, but have a liberating pursuit of subjective meaning. Yet, fans' admiration of this original author cannot be understated, as fans of Tolkien were devoted to the point of religious fervour, with this aspect of the fandom being where Barthes' theory proves unsatisfactory. This protectionism from the fans over the novels can be seen clearly in the Tolkien forum. Well, he certainly will include it. How else can he go about it? I sincerely hope he sticks as close to the book as possible, as Jackson's success for most viewers was in how closely he resided to Tolkien, revealing a consciousness amongst the fans where fidelity to the books is paramount. Barthes' argument that to give a text an author is to impose a limit on that text seems to juxtapose the intentions of the fandom, as it is precisely in this author where value is ascribed. Sandvoss uses Wolfgang Iser's work to reveal that most fanfiction is not pursuing this difference Barthes is pointing to, but the opposite: familiarity and the fulfillment of expectations, as the premise of the author is welcomed by fans who don't want to flee from Tolkien's world but journey back to him. Sandvoss continues in how the disappearance of the author and fundamental redrawing of textual boundaries at the point of consumption are rarely complete, as is evident in fans' frequent sense of disappointment with their fan texts, which demonstrates how to remove the anchor of the author from any text leaves fans ultimately dissatisfied, as their recreations fall short of the original. Therefore, Jackson and fans have contributed to the franchise, yet in the process have reinstated the author, as to remove him from the text would be to remove the foundation, as readers' perceptions and valuations of meaning stem from him. In summary, The Lord of the Rings has certainly exceeded the expectations of Tolkien, generating a reception that has stitched the franchise into the fabric of popular culture due to the major successes of film adaptations and fervent fan devotion. For these reasons, Barthes' theory unveils the futility in rooting any one text in one author, as it is undeniable that the series has been changed since its publication, as well as being inspired by ancient mythology and language structures from the start. Yet its successes cannot be completely divorced from the author, where the reader's pursuit of meaning ultimately does not rest in subjectivity, but in a reliance on a particular hypotext. Therefore, whilst J.R.R. Tolkien cannot be given the author-god status that Barthes discouraged, without his investment in the philological makeup of medieval folklore, as well as his modernization of subsequent tropes, England, and indeed the world, would be deeply impoverished. For fans, the true meaning in this instance derives from journeying to Tolkien, there and back again.